Continuing the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, translated by James Haughton Poets. And we're in number 7 of book 1. After perception and before verbal communication, because in the first place verbal communication depends on inference, so far as it obtains its validity from a knowledge of the connective power of words, sambandha resulting from an inference with regard to cognition would be on the part of the hearer which inference is based on, actions and so on, and in the second place because in the sutra the inferred is followed in enumeration by verbal communication. Therefore he gives the characteristic marks of inference before he gives those of verbal communication. In the words subject of the elation, a subject of elation is a subject dharman, distinguished by attributes dharma, which we wish to know, things belonging to the same class with it. The subject of elation are objects similar to the genius, which is an attribute of the major term sadhya, which as the objects are familiar instance sapaksa, which is present in these belonging to the same class. With these words he excludes both contrariety and lack of community as between an attribute of the middle term sadhana dharma and the attributes of the major. Things belonging to different classes are dissimilar instances, and they are other than the similar instances. That is contrary to them and containing the negation of them. Absent from these, things belonging to a different class, accordingly Todd. By this he rules out over-inclusive sadharana, non-coextensiveness, anaikan. Things are brought into relation, such is the use of this word relation, a syllogistic mark, linga, thus describing the minor premise, paksa dharmata. He avoids the fallacious reasoning, a siddhata of the svarupa type, refers to that, means having necessary connection with that, because the etymology of the word refers the saya. Based on this statement of Vatapatha, verse 2, that the root of means necked with the words the ascertainment of the genius, he distinguishes the objects of the inference from the object of perception. Inference arises on condition that there will be awareness of a relation between the two terms, insofar as in the case of particulars, one does not apprehend relations, it is only genius which is affording to ease. Apprehension of the relations comes into the distance, for he gives an example in the passage beginning thus, for instance, the word cha after the word vindhya carries with it a reason, because vindhya, range, has no motion, therefore it does not get from one place to another. Hence, as there is an absence of motion, gete nivrittau, there is an absence of getting from one place to another, and conversely, because they do not get from one place to another, the moon and stars, like Chaitra, do have motion. Thus the point is established, 3, of fluctuation, which is a verbal communication. He gives the distinguishing characteristic in the words a trustworthy person and so on. Insight and compassionateness and dexterity of the sentence organs combined into trustworthiness. A man whose ways are governed by that is a trustworthy one. He is the one by whom the object is seen or inferred. Unless there be a heard word, there is no receiving of the seen or inferred object on the part of another person, because in so far as this word is rooted in something that can be seen or inferred, it is only by these two that the meaning becomes complete. His knowledge, therefore, passing over to some persons means that in the mind stuff of the hearer that arises into consciousness, knowledge similar to, knowledge found in the mind stuff of the trustworthy person to effect this passing, a thing is mentioned, that is made known as a means to obtain what is good for the hearer and to avoid what is bad for him. The rest is easy, the verbal communication, the utterer of what declares an incredible thing. For example, these identical 10 pomegranates are going to be 6 cakes. Not a thing which he desires has himself seen or inferred. For example, a shrine, let him worship who desired heaven. That verbal communication wavers. An objector says that if that be so, then the verbal communication, even of such person as Manu, would waver, and thus they would be supreme authorities, for even they declared things which themselves have not seen or inferred. In reply, he says that if the original utterer for in the case of such persons, Tatra, the original utterer is the Ishvara, who had himself seen or inferred the things. For instance, it is said at Manu 2:7, whatever law has been ordained for any person by Manu, every such law had been already laid down in the Veda. That surely contains within itself all knowledge. This is the meaning. 8. Misconceptions. Misconception is an erroneous idea, not based on that form in respect of what the misconception is in respect of which the misconception is entertained. Erroneous idea, jnana. Jnana is idea, right? Why is it not a source of valid idea? Because it is inhibited by the source of a valid idea, for the reason that the source of a valid idea has for its object a positive fact. In such case, there is evidently an inhibition of the source of the invalid idea by the source of the valid idea, as far as instance as the erroneous visual perception of 2 moons is inhibited by the actual sadvisaya visual perception of 1 moon. This fluctuation, namely misconception, proves to be that well-known 5-jointed undifferentiated consciousness, the joints of which are enumerated at 2-3 in the words undifferentiated consciousness, and the feeling of personality and passion and hatred and the will to live are the hindrances. These same are known by the particular technical designations: obscurity and infatuation, and extreme infatuation and darkness, and blind darkness. These will be discussed in connection with the subject of the defilements of the mind stuff. 8. Misconception is an erroneous idea that is not based on that form in respect of which the misconception is entertained. Which misconceptions entertain? Probably a better word to put it. The word misconception indicates the thing to be characterized. The words erroneous idea and so on give a distinguishing characteristic, a form which appears in connection in consciousness as the idea, jnana, is unbased on that form, or to put it, as does the sutra, not based on that form, as to give another example in which the negation applies to the action and not to the object. One who does not eat, one who eats not the funeral feast. Accordingly, doubt would also be included in the definition of the misconception, but there is a distinction to this extent. In this case, the case of doubt, the failure to be based on the true form is overridden by clear perception, jnana, but on the other case, such as the vision of the 2 moons, the misconception is overridden by the perception of the inhibition of the one idea by the other idea. An objector says, if this be granted, the predicate relation, vilkalpa, in that it is not based on the true form, but also be upon consideration, prove it to be a misconception. In reply to this, he says, an erroneous perception. For these words describe an inhibition familiar in common experience to everybody. Now this inhibition occurs in this conception, but not in the predicate relation, forasmuch as the business of life is done by this predicate relation, and because, on the other hand, only the learned kind of persons, when they might be engaged in reflection, would have in this matter any idea of an inhibition, the author of the comment puts forward the objection: why is it not a source of valid idea? The point is that a previous perception should not be inhibited by a latter perception, which has incurred contradiction. On the contrary, the latter perception should be inhibited by just that previous perception which occurred first and has not incurred contradiction. He gives the rebuttal in the words because by a source of valid idea. For this rule of the Mimamsa applies evam when a latter perception arises in dependence from a previous, but in the present ease, two perceptions, each from its particular cause, in entire independence of each other, spring up. According, the latter perception does not attain to arise into consciousness unless it has destroyed the earlier perception, and in fact its rise into consciousness has its being in the removal of the previous perception by inhibition. But it is not true that the rise into consciousness of a previous perception has its being in an inhibition of the latter, for the reason that, at that time, the time of the earlier perception, this latter perception does not yet exist. Hence the fact that one perception has not incurred contradiction is the reason why another perception is to be inhibited, and hence also the fact is that a perception has incurred contradiction is the reason why it should act as an inhibitor. Consequently, it is established that the source of a valid idea, because its object is a positive fact, can inhibit the source of an invalid idea. An example is given in the words, in such case, by the source of the valid idea. In order that it may be rejected, he shows the worthlessness of this source of invalid ideas, i.e., of undifferentiated consciousness, in the words, this, that, five. So undifferentiated consciousness, as a genius, exists in five special forms, literally in five joints, namely undifferentiated consciousness, sense of personality, and so on. The mental process, buddhi, which recognizes, compare, 2-5. The self in 8 forms which are not the self, that is in the undeveloped primary substance and in the great thinking substance and the substance of personality and the 5 subtle elements. Tanmatra is undifferentiated consciousness. The obscurity, similarly the mental process which welfare informs where no welfare is, in atomization, Animan, technical C345, and the rest of the 8 supremacies of yogins is eightfold this infatuation. This is worse than the previous. Than the preceding. Well, same thing. And it is called the sense of personality, asmita. In this way, after one has obtained eightfold supremacy by yoga, and after becoming perfected, siddha, the resolution atmika, pratipatin, atmika pratipatin, to enjoy the 10 objects which are seen in the world, drsta, and taught in the Shastra, Anu Shravika, C115, is called an extreme infatuation. This is desire. In any case, atomization and the other supremacies do not come into play. And utpatau, because while working on in this way, with the same intention, he is impeded by something or other. Then, while he is bound by this impediment, there arises, from the failure to enjoy the object seen in the world and taught in the Shastra, anger towards the impediment. This is the so-called darkness. This is hatred. In like manner, if he have success with the supernatural qualities, atomization, and so on, if he dwell in thought close to the object seen in the world and taught in the Shastra, then the fear that all this will perish at the end of the mundane period is the will to live, the so-called blind darkness. It hath been said, Samkhya Karika 48. There are 8 kinds of obscurity and infatuation. Extreme infatuation is of 10 kinds. Darkness is 8-fold. Likewise, blind darkness. So remember, clinging. You won't even want reincarnation if you're not clinging. Oh, I want reincarnation. It's like, well, that's because you're clinging to things. The desires of things. But you realize things are the desires, and if it's not best to obtain them, or you just haven't been able to attain them, you got to learn to let that pass, right? I'm not here to criticize anybody for their mere desires, for their mere thoughts. But when these are factored into disbelief and misbelief, might be a better way to phrase that, and misbehavior, well, that's different than mere feelings and thoughts and emotions. That's it's been put into a character. It's been put into a deed. 9. The predicate relation, vilkalpa, is without any corresponding perceptible object, and follows as a result of perceptions or of words. This predicate relation does not amount to a source of valid ideas, nor does it amount to a misconception, in spite of the fact that there is no corresponding perceptible object. Nevertheless, because there is dependence upon the authority of perceptions or of words, something is evidently said. Literally, there appears something said, vyavahara, which possesses a dependence. Thus, for instance, when it is said by some philosophers that the true nature of the self is intelligence, chaitanya, then, in this case, of absence of perceptible object, we may well ask, since the self is itself nothing but intelligence, what thing is in the attributive relation to what other thing? For cha, the expressive force, verte of the language, lies in the attributive relation. As for instance, Chaitra's cow. The cow is distinguished as being Chaitra's, who is something different from her. Likewise, there is expressive force when the subject and the predicate are identical. When, for instance, the self is said to be the unchanging, absolute, and thus is characterized by the negation of some quality, which is found in some perceptible thing, or when there is a connection, between a positive and a negative. When, for instance, it is said, the arrow comes to a standstill, or will come to a standstill, or has come to a standstill. The bare meaning of the verbal root, sutta, stand still, compared to page 23, is understood to be not to move. In this case, also, there is expressive force in the attributive relation, even of the absence of any factor, or karaka. So, too, there is expressive force in the sentence, the self is something which has the property that it does not come into existence. All that is meant is that there is an absence of the property of coming into existence, not any negative property inherent in the self. Therefore, this property, which is a negation so far as perceptible objects are concerned, is predicated, and as such, it is something that is thought. Vyavahara. And the verse again, 9. The predicate relation, Lokalpa, is without any object and follows as a result of perceptions or of words. The objection is made that if the predicate relation follows as a result of perceptions or of words, then one would have to admit that it is included under that source of valid ideas which is termed verbal communication. Or, on the other hand, if the predicate relation has no corresponding perceptual object, it ought to be a misconception. In reply to this, he says, this predicate relation does not. This is not included among sources of valid ideas, nor among misconceptions. Why not? Because he says, object, with the words, in spite of that fact, there is no corresponding perceptual object. He denies that the predicate relation is included among the sources of valid ideas. As with the words, because there is dependence upon the authority of perceptions or of words, he denies that it includes among misconceptions. What he means to say, that a man in some cases falsely attributes divinity to things that are identical, and again, in other cases, identity to things that are diverse. Attributes diversity, not divinity. Diversity to things that are identical, and again to things, other cases, identity to things that are diverse. Therefore, since identity and diversity are non-existent as perceptible objects, the portrayal of Bhasya of these two is a predicate relation and not the source of a valid idea, nor yet would it be a misconception, because it is not a contradiction with the fact that something is said. He gives an illustration which is well established in the systems, Shastra, in the words, thus, for instance, what subject Vicheshya is in the attributive relation, Vyapadichyate, that is defined, Vicheshyate, by what other thing? For when there is identity, there is no relation of subject and predicate. Because, for instance, a cow cannot be defined as a cow, but by something different from herself, by Chaitra. To this, he replies by the phrase, for the expressive force of language lies in the attributive relation, the relation between that to which the attribute is to be applied and that which furnishes the attribute is the attributive relation, that is to say, the relation of predicate and subject. In this lies the expressive force, vritte, of the sentence. As, for instance, Chaitra's cow. He adds another example, found nowhere but in the books of the systems, Chastriya. Likewise, there is expressive force. A negated quality found in some perceptible thing would be, for instance, motion, a quality belonging to some perceptible thing as earth, and this quality is belonging to self, is negated. Who would that one thus characterized be? The self is said to be the unchanging absolute. Surely, it cannot be urged that Samkhya system, that there is a certain quality in this perceptible object called non-existence, and that the self could be defined by this. And it's quite the thing to call yourself the absolute. No, you're obviously a limited portion, but you got to figure out what you are behind all the titles and whatnot, right? Surely it cannot be urged in a Samkhya system that there is a certain quality in perceptible objects that called non-existence, and that a perceptible thing are negated. And that the self could be defined by this. Sometimes there is found a reading qualities of a perceptible thing are negated. The meaning of this word would be that negated qualities are these concomitant with negation. Qualities of perceptible objects cannot be concomitant with this negation, because in them there cannot be a connection between an existent and a non-existent. While on the other hand, in this way, by the predicate relation, there is distinct knowledge. In the words, the arrow is coming to a standstill, he gives an example from everyday life. Just as when we say he cooks or he chops, we mean that the accumulated moments of an action in serial order and characterized by a unity in the result are distinctly known. So it is also quite truly a serial order which he refers when he says comes to a standstill. When he says will come to a standstill, has come to a standstill, then some objector might say, if we grant that the action of coming to a standstill is like that of cooking, then the arrow could have as its attribute an action, namely stopping still, which is in a serial order and is over and above. Penna. Penna? Yeah, penna. The arrow itself. To this, he replies, that stopping still is not a series of actions, but that the bare meaning of the word of the verbal root is understood to be not to move. To begin with tavat, not to move, is mental structure, kalpita. Then two, api, the existence in positive form, bhavarupatva, of this non-moving reading tasya api, is a mental structure, and then two, a serial order in this existence in positive form is again a mental structure. If that is what you mean at the what a string of mental structures, such is the intention of the comment. On the other hand, a non-existent is conceived, gamyate, as in relation with all the selves, although not with perceptible objects, not only cha, as if it were an existent, but also cha, as if it were inherent, anugata, provided it be a mental structure, but a non-existent is not any kind of propriety. Existentially distant from the self. By way of another illustration, he says, so too, the property that it does not come into existence. Many thinkers of the Mimamsa and the Nyaya schools have advanced the assertion that there is no fluctuation called predicate relation, other than the source of valid ideas are the misconception. To enlighten them is, as we may suppose, the purpose of this abundance of illustration. Now, some people are obviously going to consider this my favorite material that they do, and others are going to look at this and say, this is the most boring stuff that he's done. But the development of the mind is important. A system that one can consider of, okay, how does spirituality, one's worship, how does this refer to the awareness practice and the connecting practices and all that other stuff? Namaste. I pray for you.